Welcome back to the shed. Today we're going to take a look at the 1981 Nebula award-winning novel, In the Claw of the Conciliator by Gene Wolfe. So to do this book justice, we really need to take a bit of a step back, because it's really just a progression from the first book, The Shadow of the Torturer. So today's review, we're going to really take a look at both The Shadow and The Claw in the SF Masterworks combined copy. So we're led to believe that Gene Wolfe has come across a manuscript, a diary of sorts, and he's translating this diary from an unknown language. And I'll talk to some of that in my likes and dislikes session, because it makes for a rather interesting read. So the book is written in a first-person narrative. We're really seeing the diary entries of this person called Severian, and he's a journeyman in the Guild of Torturers. So he's a torturer. So what we find is that Severian, as a young man, was playing in this necropolis, and he comes across this guy called Vodulus. And Vodulus was just about to be apprehended by some soldiers. Severian intercedes and saves Vodulus' life. And in return, Vodulus gives him this gold coin as a token of his appreciation. So sometime later, we find that there's this young woman called Thecla, who's been imprisoned in the Torturers Guild, which happens in the Citadel rather, which is rather interesting because the Citadel appears to be this rocket of some sort, some kind of spaceship. So it's got metal walls, and it's very descriptive of what an internal of a spaceship would look like. But it plays home to this Citadel, and a whole lot of real dark torture stuff happens in the guild. And Thecla happens to be one of their customers, as they call them, because her half-sister, Thea, is actually seeing Vodulus. So I think they're lovers. And so they've taken Thecla into custody to try and get some information from this Vodulus guy so that could bring him to justice. And in the process, we find that young Severian is quite smitten by Thecla. He falls in love, and a couple of things happen in there which result in Severian being exiled from the Citadel, and is on the road to Thrax. So on the way to Thrax, Severian encountered this traveling show made up of this giant of a person called Bold Anders, and his it appears to be his master in this guy called Dr. Talus. And they're running some kind of, sideshow, feeder show on the way. And Severian sort of says, hey, yeah, well, this could be bit of company as I'm heading towards Thrax, so I'll just join him for a little while. And he does that and befriends this Dr. Talus and Bold Anders. So on their way to Thrax, Severian also encounters this woman called Agia, and the two sort of hit it on, and they form a friendship of sorts. And they also come across this group of traveling priesthood called the Pellerines, who are holding this claw of the Conciliator. This jewel, it's some kind of gemstone. So that happens, and in all of this, it's just a wonderful, magical, sort of really weird book in ways, because they end up in this sort of garden, and in this garden, there's all sort of really weird, magical things happening, really fantastical things that happen in this garden. One of which is Severian falls into this lake, and he's rescued by this woman called Dorcas, who also seemed to be in this lake. And this lake is where they sort of tend to throw dead people, right, when they die, like as sort of a graveyard of sorts. But anyway, he's pulled out of this lake by Dorcas, this woman. And again, Severian is quite taken by her. Dorcas joins this traveling group as well as this woman called Jalenta. Anyway, so they're making their way, and the first book, The Shadow of the Torturer, ends with Severian and his crew coming to this wall, and it's not quite certain what happens, but there's some kind of riot, some kind of violence, and the book ends and the first part. And the reason I gave a bit of a plot overview of what happens in the first book is because you'd be completely lost if you tried to read The Claw of the Conciliator without having that background. Because the characters are all there, and there's no real backstory to introduce you to these characters as you would expect in a sequel. So the book doesn't really read like a sequel. It just really does read like a continuation. So I think you owe it to yourself that if you really want to read Gene Wolfe's The Claw of the Conciliator, you do really need to read both books, at least the first volume, to get a feel for the novel. So the second book really starts where the first one left off. We find that the crew is somehow disbanded, and we find out Severian is just traveling alone with Jonas, and he's practicing his executioning rites, right? So he's now he's still on his way to Thrax, but he's practicing to be an executioner, or actually being hired as an executioner. And one of those people he executes is none other than Volgulus's men, one of Volgulus's men. So in revenge of that act, Severian and Jonas, his traveling companion, are captured and held hostage. But Volgulus sort of remembers the deed that young Severian did back in the Necropolis in the first novel, and grants pardon to Severian, and basically allows him to join his group of outlaws. And he's been given a task. He needs to go and send a message or deliver a message to a person in the House of Absolute. And this House of Absolute is a pretty interesting place because it's just a prison. And some of the prisoners are free to go, but they're held there indefinitely, which sort of, results in a rather peculiar behavior by some of these inmates. So I'll leave, that up to you to read the book, but it's a rather interesting bit of aspect of the novel. So they go on to deliver their play, and then the book comes to a pretty chaotic end. So look, it's a wonderful novel, The Claw of the Conciliator, and I would say volume 1 of the Book of the New Sun. It's just a wonderful blend of science fiction and fantasy. It really is just a blend of the two. It's written in this, far distant future where the sun seems to have, demised and is no longer as strong as it used to be. Hence the talk of a new sun, right? Because the sun's soul, as we know it, is sort of fading and it's in its last life. So a whole lot of stuff has happened with man and his evolution, and it looks like, again, we've gone past the peak of humanity's reign on Earth. So what did I like? I really enjoyed the mixture of science fiction and fantasy. It has a really nice blend of a far distant Earth, of space rockets and weird alien technology and artifacts, with that fantasy element, with magical creatures that walk in the garden, with all these magical, mythological elements thrown in. So I really did enjoy that mix of science fiction and fantasy themes. The other thing I really found, and I sort of mentioned it in my interview, I mentioned it in my introduction, that we're led to believe that Gene Wolfe had just found this manuscript and he's translating it from this unknown language to English for our pleasure, right? And what that results in is some of the words that he uses don't have a basis in English language. They're not actually real words. They're made up words. But from what I could figure, they're pretty much are based on Latin or Jamaic words, but they're made up words. So as you're reading through these novels, you come across a word and you think, don't know what this means. You hit your thesaurus and you realize, well, hang on, this is not even a word. So it sort of really lends itself to this mysterious and rather dark and disturbing narrative, right? Because we're talking about this executioner, this guildsman of the order of torturers, right? So it's really some really dark themes. And I think that made-up language and the prose in that made-up language really adds to that sense of mystery, to that sense of darkness and morbid reality. So I thought wonderfully done, really wonderful prose. I also found myself, that the second book, the prose was slightly different to what you find in the first, in The Shadow of the Torturer. I found when I was reading The Shadow, I really had to slow my reading down. It wasn't a book that I could just fly through. And it wasn't just because of the words that Gene Wolfe made up or the prose, but it's more towards the prose. It's just written in a really archaic way, and you find yourself having to slow down just to make sure that you've really understood what is being said here. So I'd have to say I had to slow my reading down to about 50%. So the book took me a lot longer than it would normally take me to read a book of, just shy of 600 pages, because I did have to find myself slowing down to make sure I'm fully following along. But what I liked about that is that it really allowed you to slow down and enjoy the beautiful writing that I think is in Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun. But yeah, it doesn't make for a quick read. The other thing that's rather interesting in this novel, and it's not a like or a dislike, it's Severian himself as a narrator. Now, I would call him an unreliable narrator, right? And the reason I say that is, during the novel, I mean, it's well detailed, right? He recollects what people are wearing, what birds were singing, you know, what he was feeling at the time, what people were saying in a conversation in exact words, right? So he had this sort of immaculate memory that was just infallible. But sometimes he would omit certain things, right? And I'll leave it at that because I don't want to give spoilers away. But if you pay close attention, you'll find that he's not a very reliable narrator, because it's what he doesn't say that I think allows you to really question a little bit more about how truthful is Severian in his narrative here. Because he does, yeah, it's not that he outright lies. I don't think he lies, but he omits certain truths. So yeah, look, I would love to hear your thoughts on it if you've read the novel, if you have the same kind of view. And I don't really want to name examples as to spoil the reading experience for you, but I found there were a couple of times where it's what he didn't say that made me question just how reliable of a narrator is young Severian. So what didn't I like? Look, I can't say it enough. I really did enjoy Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun, both The Claw and The Shadow. But one of the things that sort of jumped out at me, and I thought, oh, come on, Severian, dude, do you really even know what love is, right? Because honestly, every single woman he comes across in this novel, and it's not so much that he's a womanizer, more like a hopeless romantic, I think I would describe him as. But every single woman he comes across, he falls in love with, right? And he literally says, I'm in love with this woman. I'm in love with Thecla. I'm in love with Dorcas. I'm in love with Agia. I'm in love with just about, you know, Jolenta. I'm just in love with every single woman that I've ever come across. So again, that sort of added to that unreliable narrator. Are you really in love with these people? Are you trying to, you know, get a point across of maybe perhaps the real character that you have, or you maybe just a complete cold-hearted torturer? We're not quite sure, right? And that's the beauty of this unreliable narrator. But that was one of the things that jumped out at me, is just, dude, you fall in love with every single person you meet. The other thing that I would say is not necessarily a dislike, but an observation. This book, I would say, doesn't really have any peaks and troughs, right, as far as the narrative goes. There's no, like, you know, build-up and climatic you know, and then a cessation from there. What we find is there's a pretty steady pace throughout the whole novel. Even when you get towards the end of the book, right, you have Severian, you know, when we get to the war in the first novel, basically, you know, thanking the reader of the novel, saying, hey, don't know why you got this far, but I'm, you know, if you want to follow me along with the next journey, because it's not an easy journey, I encourage you to follow me in my next release, sort of thing, right, as to where I'm going to take this journey. So it sort of had that, you know, pretty level pacing throughout, and almost at times an invitation not to continue reading, which I thought, you know, sort of strange and refreshing in some ways, but also a bit of a hook, right? You think, well, you don't get out of it that easily, Severian. I want to see where this takes me, and I am going to continue reading to find out exactly where this story is going, right? So yeah, look, not necessarily a criticism, just an observation. So when it comes to recommendations, look, I think the clear standout recommendation for The Claw, which is a great cover art, this one, for The Claw and The Shadow, I think is if you like science fiction, this does read in many ways like a science fiction novel, but in so many ways it reads like a fantasy novel. So I think it's just one of those perfect books that if you're a fantasy reader who wants to get into science fiction and not quite sure how to go about that, start with, I think, Gene Wolfe, because it is that wonderful blend of both. And I'd say the converse of that for a science fiction reader who's maybe wanting to extend out to fantasy and see what the fantasy landscape is about. Again, this is just one of those classic, I think, for me, bridging novel that really does marry those two worlds together quite nicely. Look, the other recommendation in reading this novel, and I've covered this book in the past on our channel, and I'm talking about Robert Silverberg's Nightwings, right? Robert Silverberg's Nightwings. In so many ways, you could really say that Gene Wolfe's universe is in the same universe that Robert Silverberg's Nightwings is set in. This because Nightwings, if you haven't seen my review, I highly encourage you to read it, to watch it. It's one of my favorite books. But it's also set in a very distant future. It is also set in a world where everyone belongs to a particular guild. And I couldn't help but think when I was reading Severian's tale here, that this could, the Guild of Torturers could easily have been a guild in Robert Silverberg's Nightwings. I thought there was a lot of similarities between the worlds. So yeah, I think if you enjoy Nightwings and you love the world building in Nightwings, I think there's a lot of similarities in Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun. So yeah, that would definitely be a recommendation for me as well. So what about the memory test? I first read The Claw of the Conciliator as a standalone novel back in, I think it was about 2010, so about 10, 13 years ago. And what I remember reading it at the time, I thought, oh man, I'm just lost here. I'm not quite sure what's going on. And I think I got to about halfway through the novel and I said, nah, I've got to go back a bit and read the first novel because I'm just lost here, right? Hence my recommendation earlier in the video. So I started reading my Claw of the Conciliator version, and I just had to stop. I did not finish, and I went back to the first book, read the first book, really enjoyed the second book. But look, what I would have to say about it is that it is memorable in the sense that I really strongly record the combination of science fiction and fantasy, right? My key takeaway is that this was just a wonderful blend of both science fiction and fantasy. That's the number one takeaway for me. The other one, I definitely remembered Terminus Est. And how can I not mention Terminus Est? Terminus Est is a sword that Severian has been gifted by one of his superiors just as he was leaving the Citadel, the Torturer's Citadel. And it's this massively long sword that he oils constantly, and it's a beautiful piece of craftsmanship and a killing machine all in one, right? So what I do remember clearly is Terminus Est. We don't see it on this copy of the books that I have. Well, actually you do. You see it on the cover of this one, or at least a representation of it. But I do remember Terminus Est and Severian and that imagery that the book portrayed, right? So it's very strong imagery. That's one thing I really remembered. I just remembered that dark image of this torturer guy dressed in this really black, dark material that it almost renders him invisible, yielding this wonderfully long, majestic, wonderful swordsmanship of a sword, right? So that imagery I took away, and it stayed with me forever. And it's a very dark novel in many ways as well. When they're in that Citadel, there's some pretty dark stuff that happens in there. But yeah, look, that's the key takeaway, the things that I remember. So look, highly recommend the novel. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend you do. It's a wonderful novel. We've got to go and rank it on our Hugo and Nebula award-winning shed ladder, which never gets any easier. So I'm really going to struggle, I think, today as to where this one goes. I'd love for you to join me. So back to the shed ladder and ranking tonight's 1981 Nebula award-winning novel in Gene Wolfe's The Claw of the Conciliator. So from ascending to descending order, we've got A side and B side. And I've been ranking all these wonderful books, and some of the criteria that I use is how strong are those science fiction or fantasy themes, how strong are the characters, and how well developed are they. Is the plot interesting? Is it well written? Is it memorable? That's all the criteria that I sort of put these books to help me make a ranking. So when I look at some of the inputs into The Claw of the Conciliator, when it comes to how strong is a science fiction or fantasy theme, I'd have to say that in and on their own, they're not that great. As in, the science fiction themes are not that strong. The fantasy themes are not that strong. But what I think makes it for a wonderful reading experience is the combination of both science fiction and fantasy. So that concept, I think, is a really strong one and is a standout in what we have on the board so far. So that's going to score quite highly based on that. The other one is how well developed are these characters. I really enjoyed the character of Severian. I love the imagery of this dark, mysterious, clad in black, wielding big magic sword. That imagery is just unforgettable. I've just loved the concept. And I also hinted at in my review of the, unreliable narration, right? How reliable is Severian in his storytelling? And that adds an element of mystery that I think makes it for a complicated and complex character. You're not quite sure what's prompting Severian to write this diary and what he's done. So that sense of mystery, I think, adds to the great character development. Some of the other characters were okay as well, but I thought Severian was a standout. So again, it's going to rank quite highly. How memorable is the story? That bit is where I think it falls a bit short. I do remember the imagery of Severian, right? The imagery is very strong. But, you know, his journey into that garden, I've forgotten about the journey into the garden. His journey into the House of Absolute and his imprisonment there. There was very little I could remember about that. So when it comes to plot and how memorable was the plot, it probably doesn't rank that highly. But it's a wonderful novel. It's a wonderfully written novel, one that you have to slow down to fully appreciate. So where's it going to land? It's going to be a difficult one, because I sort of started looking through my, you know, fantasy novels like The Fifth Season, and it's a million times better, in my opinion, than the Fifth Season. Then I started looking at, well, maybe something like Relate the Sweetbird Saying is where we should start. But then I thought, well, Relate the Sweetbird Saying wasn't that memorable either. But I did remember the imagery of Severian, right? I can't shake that image out of my head. Then I started looking at things like the Uplift series and the Uplift War and Startide Rising. And I thought, yeah, but those concepts were much stronger than what we get in Gene Wolfe's. Which then I looked at Flowers for Algernon and I thought, wow, Flowers for Algernon is just a wonderful novel. And the reason it ranks where it does is because from a science fiction, you know, point of view, there's not a whole lot of science fiction, right? It's just a wonderful piece of fiction. And the only thing that really categorizes it as science fiction is that we're talking about surgery that is not yet available, right? So that's the only reason Flowers sits there. Otherwise, it would be probably number one, right? I love Flowers for Algernon. But then I looked at this novel for, well, the concepts here are science fiction. They're definitely fantasy. So I've got to rank it above Flowers. And I also like some of the concepts in this novel just a little bit better, right? Which then took me down to Red Shirts here. And like I mentioned in the parts in my review of Red Shirts, I really enjoyed Star Trek. I'm a big Star Trek fan. And sometimes I wonder just how biased I am allowing Red Shirts to sit here. Because I think The Claw of the Conciliator is definitely better than Red Shirts, right? So it's going to sit above that. Is it going to sit above The Demolished Man or Ringworld? And this is where I'm really stuck. And I thought I'd share my thoughts with you ad hoc live. So The Demolished Man was a really interesting reverse, you know, murder mystery novel. So we knew who committed the crime. It was just about providing the evidence and bringing the antagonist to justice, right? But I'd have to say that The Claw Conciliator makes for a much more enjoyable read. I think, you know, it is a book that improves on a second reading. Now, is it fair to say that you should read a book multiple times to fully get an appreciation of those novels? Look, I'm not going to say one way or the other, but I would definitely say the more times you read The Claw, and I've read it several times, the more you read Claw, the more you think, that's what that thing was. That's what's going on here with the spaceship thing, right? So you do get some answers when you read the books in successions and you read the sequels and you come back to reread the books from the beginning. You start to get glimpses of the story a bit better, and it does mature. It does get much more engaging second time round, which I don't think is necessarily the case with The Demolished Man, right? The Demolished Man was a book that you read once, you thoroughly enjoy, and you may read 25 years in the future, right? Which is exactly what happened with me and The Demolished Man. So I'm going to have to say it is better than The Demolished Man, but I'm going to say it's not better than Ringworld, right? That Ringworld concept is just fantastic. I think some of the writing is more interesting. I wouldn't say necessarily better, but more interesting. Like that sort of archaic, mysterious writing and prose makes it for a very dark and sinister almost reading experience. So I find the reading experience a little bit better, but conceptually Ringworld is just so much stronger. So I'm going to rank tonight's Nebula award-winning novel just above The Demolished Man and just below Ringworld. So I'm going to finish tonight's novel with a quote from Neil Gaiman, because I think he's a lot more eloquent in his description of this novel than I could possibly ever be. Because I'm going to read it because I think this summarizes my whole reading experience of the New Sun trilogy. So it goes like this. Reading Gene Wolfe is dangerous work. It's a knife-throwing act. And like all good knife-throwing acts, you may lose your fingers, toes, earlobes or eyes in the process. Gene doesn't mind. Gene is throwing the knives, right? That's a bit, really honestly, what you're getting with this novel. It's just a bit of a knife-throwing act, and you just want to avoid some of those knives as to not lose an earlobe, but you're rewarded with a very entertaining read. Hey, this has been the Sci-Fi Shed. I've been Peter, and I hope to see you next time in the shed.